Fermented beans. Nope, not natto. This is a different probiotic fermented bean recipe and can be made with any kind of cooked bean or even lentil. You can ferment any kind of bean you want, such as Great Northern, kidney, chili, pinto, etc. However, no matter what type of bean you use, the beans must be cooked first. This, of course, means that there will be no beneficial bacteria on the beans to initiate fermentation. Therefore, we will be using a starter culture. I'm going to share with you 2 different probiotic starters you can use that I found to give the best results. Let's get started. For all the measurements in both American Imperial and metric, I've got a recipe link in the description. To start, cook your beans of choice until very well done. If you've never cooked beans before and don't know how, there's lots of videos out there that will show you. I personally cook mine in my Instant Pot. However, for this video recipe, I'm going to bypass teaching how to cook beans and pick up with the beans being already freshly cooked. The majority of the beans need to have their outer skin broken or cracked open in order for the microbes of the starter culture to be able to penetrate past the skins and into the starch. The starch is the food source for the starter culture microbes to do their fermentation thing. If the majority of the bean skins are not broken, this could increase the failure chances of the fermentation. So if needed, you can use your hands or a fork additionally to break the beans open. Just don't mash the beans. Starter culture option number 1, kombucha, store-bought or home brew. If you make your own kombucha, then that is great, but if you don't, then store-bought works just as well. If you buy, I recommend buying unflavored. Wash the jar with hot soapy water. To start, you'll need 1 cup total of chopped vegetables. I prepared some for myself here: zucchini, red onion, red bell pepper, and carrot. You can take liberties here and create your own vegetable combination. Garlic, green onion, radish, leek, cabbage are all great options in addition to the zucchini, carrot, and bell pepper. Mix and match to meet your palate. Add the veggies to the bowl. Then add your well-cooked beans. Mix them together and then add to the jar. For my metric friends, the bean and vegetable measurements are intentionally volume measurements and not weight measurements, because it's the quantity of the beans and the veggies that's more important for this particular recipe, not so much the weight. The jar will appear full, so settle the beans down by giving them some bumps. This will create about a 2-inch or 5-centimeter headspace. Pour off 1 cup of kombucha. Add the salt and then stir to mix. Mixing will help settle the froth. Absolutely do not skip adding the salt. It is needed for the fermenting. Pour the kombucha into the jar, then top it off with just a wee bit of water to the jar's threshold. Now you can just fill it with all kombucha and skip the water, but if you're buying the kombucha in a 16-ounce jar, to honor your dollar, you can get just enough kombucha for 2 bean jars if you stick to the adding 1 cup of kombucha plus a drizzle of water to top off. However, if you homebrew your kombucha and have plenty, go ahead and fill the jar with all kombucha plus the added salt measurement. Add a freshly washed glass fermenting weight to hold the beans down. Place on the jar a loose lid and leave on the countertop for 4 to 5 days. Afterwards, transfer to the refrigerator for long-term storage. I'll do a taste test of the beans afterwards, but I quickly want to show you the next starter culture that you can use. Plus, I'll also show you what to expect with your beans over those 4 to 5 fermentation days on the counter, so stay tuned. Starter culture option number 2, fermented vegetable brine. The brine from a previous fermentation can be used as a starter culture. For example, sauerkraut brine, pickle brine, and that's a fermented pickle, not a vinegar pickle, or white kimchi. If you go this route, make sure the brine is from a healthy and hearty fermentation, not a weak and sickly one. Add the cooked beans to the jar. If not using vegetables like with this demo, then you'll add an extra cup of beans. Use leftover brine from a finished fermentation, meaning you've eaten the contents and just have the brine left over. I always save the brines after I finish pickles or white kimchi, etc. And just keep the brine in the fridge for use for things like with soup flavorings, dressings, and in this case, for starter culture use. This is leftover sauerkraut brine from a red cabbage sauerkraut I just finished. I must note that it's actually very rare for me to have this much brine left over from a sauerkraut because typically once sauerkraut is placed in the fridge, it often sucks up its own brine, leaving very little free or available brine left over. Definitely do not brine rob from another fermentation that still needs to be submerged in the brine. Like I just mentioned, only use brine from a finished fermentation. Add 1 cup of the brine to the beans. Now this is important. There are recipes out there other than this one that say just a couple of tablespoons is needed as a starter culture. But when I started making fermented beans and I used less than a cup of liquid starter culture, my fermentation fail rates were over 60%. I experimented with different starter quantities and found 1 cup to be the minimum needed amount for a solid fermentation success with this bean recipe. Same goes for the kombucha I just showed you, 1 cup. Next, add 1 teaspoon salt to 3/4 cup of water. Stir to mix and then pour into the jar. And it's okay if you don't use all the water. Add the glass fermentation weight to hold the beans down. Place a tight lid on and gently rock the jar a few times to incorporate the brine and the salt water. Open it up to take a peek. Looks perfectly good. Place the lid back on, except this time loosely fit. Then set it on the countertop for 4 to 5 days before transferring to the refrigerator for long-term storage. Now here's what to expect during the fermentation period. You can just about guarantee calm yeast development between days 3 to 5. Some fermented foods are just more apt to develop calm yeast than others, and beans are one of them. But it doesn't mean that the beans have gone bad. Here's how you clean it off. And by the way, do not try to clean off the calm yeast until you are ready to place the beans into the fridge on days 4 to 5. Otherwise, it's just going to grow right back the next day. With clean hands, reach in and remove the weight. Yeah, it's a bit gross, but hands are washable. The weight removal will take care of the bulk amount of calm yeast, leaving just a little bit of cleanup remaining. With a paper towel, wipe the sides of the jar and dip down just at that brine line to capture the remaining yeast clinging to the sides. Now you've got clean, ready-to-eat beans. Place them in the fridge immediately after removing the yeast. Otherwise, the yeast just comes back quickly. Here's how to know if the beans have fermented successfully. First and foremost is smell. An off-putting or foul odor will begin anywhere from day 4 to 6 if the fermentation did not take hold. Foul odors are created by an overgrowth of bad bacteria. A successful fermentation will have a light, soury, sweet smell, nothing foul. Calm yeast doesn't really have a smell when it's sitting on a healthy fermentation. So if it stinks, that means bad bacteria are growing and the fermentation did not take place, and the beans are going bad. They should be tossed. In addition to smell, a pH reading is also quite helpful to determine a safe and healthy fermentation. Bad bacteria cannot survive an acidic pH that is below 4.5. Real quick, the beneficial microbes responsible for fermentation feed on the natural sugars of the food. When they do so, they release acidic byproducts as they proliferate. These acid byproducts, like lactic acid or acetic acid, drop the pH of the fermenting food. If the microbes are not proliferating into a successful fermentation, the pH will not drop and the food will spoil. If you have pH strips, you want to see the reading at about 4.0, that color marker, or lower. My personal preference is to use a pH meter because I like the digital reading. Here's the pH of the beans from this video on day 5. As you can see, the pH is well under 4.5 into what I call the safety zone and indicates the fermentation successfully took place, in addition to there being no foul odor. A pH reading is intended to be a complement to using your nose. A pH reading is not required, it's just a handy tool. So if you think you want to continue with fermenting in the future, I recommend getting a digital pH meter or at least pH strips because it can help with fermenting confidence. I have a video on how to use and calibrate a digital pH meter if you choose to get one. I've got a link in the description for you. P.S. If calm yeast has developed when you want to do a pH test, just stick the meter right through the yeast like this. Rinse the meter off afterwards and all is just fine. Lastly, before I do the taste test, lentils work great with this recipe too. Here's a yellow lentil that I use and it turned out delicious. The key, however, to successfully using lentils is not to overcook the lentils like with the beans. If the lentils turn to mush, it will not work with this recipe. Cook them to just barely done so that they stay intact like this. Here are my 2 completed bean jars, so let's give them a taste test. This was the kombucha one with vegetables. That's yummy. And then this was the sauerkraut brine one. Also really yummy. Good. Now, because these had different starter cultures, kombucha and sauerkraut brine, those 2 mediums have very different flavors in their own right, so that does affect the flavor of the beans. I found this kombucha one to be a lot more like pop zesty, and this one was a little more mild, but had some remnants of the flavor of that sauerkraut. Yum, both are so good. I love the flavorful soury zing of fermented foods, and these beans are right there in the same lane of pickles and sauerkraut with that zesty sour flavor. They're like pickled beans, and of course they're probiotic as well. Now you may be wondering, how do you eat the beans? I eat mine with a couple of spoonfuls over cooked rice, a loaded baked potato over a salad, or in my taco or burrito. I suppose you could even mash them up a bit and use them as a zingy sandwich spread. That sounds actually really good. I think I'm going to try that. Just don't be afraid to be creative. However, keep in mind that if you cook the beans after fermentation, that will kill the probiotics. So room temperature is about as warm as you want the beans to get if you want to keep the probiotic effect. As with fermenting anything, an occasional fail is bound to happen here and there. Here are some questions to help troubleshoot if you experience a fermentation fail. 1. Was enough starter culture used, or did you try to skimp on the quantity? Did you skip on the salt? Did you use salt that had anti-caking agents added? Were the majority of the bean skins broken open? Did you use vegetables? I have found adding vegetables can help if you're having trouble with a beans-only jar. Sometimes 2 jars can be prepared identically at the same time with the same starter culture, and one takes while the other doesn't. If you feel that you did everything right and it didn't take, don't become discouraged and quit. Everyone who ferments anything experiences this from time to time, so just pull up your bootstraps and try again. Besides, what's the worst that can happen? You throw out some beans. Big deal. Lastly, I know some of you out there will ask if you can use yogurt, whey, or kefir as a starter culture instead. I did try yogurt and whey, and I found I got more consistent, better results with kombucha and vegetable brine. But you are welcome to experiment for yourself. I think a strong, hearty water kefir would probably work too, although I didn't try it. I'm just really quite happy with the kombucha results and the fermented vegetable brine, so that's the lane I stuck with. If you want to make more fermented foods, try my fermented pickles recipe right here, or check out my entire fermentation playlist right here. And coming soon is sourdough bread. I'll see you in the next video where we're going to make our sourdough starter. I'll be seeing you soon. Bye for now.